Hello and welcome to IB Economics. Today we start a new topic. This is externalities, and so we're just going to do a brief introduction to what externalities are and then have a look at the first type of externality, and this is negative externalities of production. So here we are, new topic, externalities 1.12. Specifically today we're looking at negative externalities of production. Externalities are market failure.
What is a market failure? When the outcome of the free, unhindered market differs from the socially optimal outcome, then the market has failed. Okay, let me give you some different types of market failures and examples of each so that you can see how the outcome in each case is not socially optimal. Let's look first at externalities. Externalities occur when there are costs or benefits to anyone not in control of the transaction or decision-making process. For example, lots of people talk on their cell phones while driving. Doesn't this impose costs on people other than that driver? From a social standpoint, talking on cell phones while driving is a market failure because too much of this activity goes on. On the flip side, think about people who get flu shots. In this case, immunization benefits not only the person getting the shot, but also everyone around this person who doesn't catch the flu from them. Yet every year, from a social standpoint, too few people get their flu shots. A second type of market failure is called public goods. Public goods are commodities or services that, from a social standpoint, tend to be underproduced because it is not clear who would or should pay for them in a free market setting. We'll get into this more specifically in episode 33, but examples include national defense and roads. The next category, adverse selection. One example of adverse selection would be health insurance. Ideally, the entire population would have health coverage, but you'll find that some people decide the cost of insurance isn't worth it, particularly people who never use the insurance. If these people drop out of the market, then the remaining insurance users are a slightly less healthy segment of the population. This causes premiums to rise so that more people drop out of the market. Ultimately, the least healthy segment of the population remains, and premiums are very high. A fourth category of market failure is moral hazard. With moral hazard, a commodity or service results in more risky behavior than would otherwise occur. Consider airbags in cars. This seems like a great safety device, doesn't it? And indeed, airbags do reduce fatalities. However, research shows that a greater percentage of cars with airbags are in accidents than cars without airbags. Why? Because people don't drive as carefully when the airbag is there as a safety net. So airbags represent a market failure in that they actually increase accidents, even though fewer accidents are fatal. Other examples of moral hazard would be having a homeowner's insurance on a home that you're building in a flood-prone or fire-prone area, or even being a large financial institution if you know that you can get a government bailout. Although there are several types of market failures, we'll focus more closely on only two: externalities in episode 32 and public goods in episode 33. Next time, externalities.
Okay, so a nice little introduction to market failure there. We have a definition here. Market failure is a situation in which the allocation of goods and services is not allocatively efficient. So that means there is another situation where an individual can be made better off without making someone else worse off at the same time. So if we can do that, we can improve allocative efficiency and reduce market failure. Allocative efficiency. Here's our definition: a state of the economy in which production represents consumer preferences. In particular, every good or service is produced up to the point where the last unit provides a marginal benefit to consumers which is equal to marginal cost. So marginal benefit equals marginal cost of producing the good. Okay, marginal benefit is additional satisfaction or utility that a person receives from consuming that additional unit of a good or service. And a person's marginal benefit is the maximum amount he or she is willing to pay to consume that additional amount of a good or a service. Marginal cost, this is the producer side, not the consumer side. Marginal cost is a change in total cost that arises when the quantity produced is incremented by one more unit. So the producer manufactures or supplies one more unit to the market, and we're specifically interested in the cost of producing that extra unit of good, that one more unit of a good. So in general terms, marginal cost at each level of production includes any additional cost required to produce that next unit, e.g. the value of the resources used to produce that additional unit. The value that consumers place on the consumption of the next unit, this is a marginal unit of output of a particular good or service, is reflected in the price of that product. Allocative efficiency is achieved when the price of the next unit of consumption is equal to the marginal cost of its production. The demand curve is the marginal benefit curve. In a free market, demand curve is both the marginal private benefit, we'll just call this MPB for now, and the marginal social benefits, MSB curve. So demand in the free market, demand equals MPB equals MSB. So we know that the first slice of pizza that's consumed is the most satisfying. It's far more satisfying than that third slice, or heaven forbid, that fifth slice that we've just eaten and feel sick from. And because that first slice of pizza, the first unit of consumption, is most satisfying, the consumer is willing to pay more to consume that first unit. This is why the demand curve is downward sloping. So the more we consume, the less satisfaction we gain from it, and the lower the price we're willing to pay for that. So after having already consumed 6 slices, that 7th slice of pizza, far less value for the consumer. If they've already consumed 6 slices of pizza, how much is that consumer willing to pay for that 7th slice? It's going to be far less, because it's not very satisfying at all. Marginal social benefit. These are the benefits to society from the consumption of one or more units of a good or a service. Now, there are times when the marginal private benefit doesn't equal the marginal social benefits, and we have 2 examples: vaccinations and cigarettes. So let's have a look at the market for vaccinations. When a person goes in for their yearly flu shot, that individual is not the sole beneficiary of that unit of consumption. They are less likely to catch the flu that year, that's for sure. But by consuming an influenza vaccine, society benefits over and above that marginal private benefit. If the consumer of the vaccine is less likely to get sick, then they're less likely to make others sick. They're going to be more productive at work, take less sick days, and they're going to be more productive at home, more able to cook the dinner, vacuum the floor, take care of the kids and the pets. So the flu shot benefits the consumer when it's consumed, marginal private benefit, and it also adds a social benefit which is greater. It's over and above the marginal private benefit. It benefits society as well. And we have the opposite situation for cigarette consumption. So when we purchase cigarettes, there is a private benefit each time a cigarette is purchased and consumed. But because the consumption of a cigarette causes significant harms to others, we get passive smoking, which leads others to pay for extra medical costs associated with the poor health outcomes of the smoker. The marginal social benefit of cigarette consumption is far less than the marginal private benefit. So when the individual cigarette is consumed, there's a private benefit, but there's a negative effect on others around that person who is consuming the cigarette. So the marginal social benefit is lower. Social benefits, social costs. We've got private benefits, that's the satisfaction of consumption, the utility that's gained from consuming the good, the pleasure. Private costs, so this is production, cost of raw materials, the cost to getting the good to the consumer. Advertising are all examples of private costs. And individual consumers and producers engage in transactions in the market. And the market transactions can affect others outside the market negatively, like we've just seen with cigarette consumption, or positively, as in the case of flu shots, immunizations. So we call these externalities. Spillover effects on third parties. These spillover effects can be positive and they can be negative. Externalities. So private benefit plus the externality equals social benefits. Private cost plus an externality equals the social cost. Marginal private benefits, marginal social benefits. That private benefit is a benefit gained from the consumption of a good or service by the consumer. Marginal private benefit is a benefit the consumer gains from consuming an additional unit of the good or service. Now, when the good is consumed, it can have a spillover effect. That's that externality. That's the effect on others in society, which we call third parties. Third parties because they are not involved in the transaction of producing or consuming. And these spillover effects are termed externalities because they affect people outside of. They are external to the market. These spillover effects can be both positive, so beneficial to society, or negative, detrimental to society, to others who have not consumed the good or service. So, for example here, again, vaccines, they not only stop the individual consumer from benefiting by not becoming sick, they stop the transmission of the disease to other people in society too. So that is a beneficial effect, and that's a positive externality. And on the other side, conversely, cigarettes can have a high private benefit to the consumer, a lot of satisfaction from taking that nicotine hit, but second-hand smoke adversely affects others. They take more sick days from the workplace, less productive, and smokers suffer serious and expensive diseases such as lung cancer that place a big strain on healthcare systems and increase overall health insurance premiums. Now, all of these negative effects are borne by society. They affect other people in society and they're termed negative externalities. Marginal social benefits are the benefits to society from the consumption of one or more unit of a good or service. A marginal social benefit is going to be greater than the marginal private benefit when positive externalities are produced when the good or service is consumed. On the other side, the marginal social benefit is going to be less when the marginal private benefit, when negative externalities are produced when the good or service is consumed. So marginal private benefit plus any externalities equals the marginal social benefit. And therefore, we can state MSB equals MPB plus the external benefits, or MSB equals MPB minus any external harm that is produced. Private costs, social costs, marginal private and marginal social cost. A private cost is cost that firms incur in producing goods and services to supply the market. These are things such as wages and rent when we're talking about the costs of production. Marginal private cost is a change in total cost that comes from a firm making or producing one additional item. Now, when a good is produced, it can also have a spillover effect. So we're not just talking about consumption. We're focusing on production here. So spillover effects on other people in society. These are third parties. And these spillover effects are termed externalities again because they affect people outside of the market, people external to the market. Now, additional costs may be imposed on third parties that may be created by firms in the production process. So if we take air pollution, for example, air pollution from a factory impacts the quality of life for others in society, and that's a negative externality. And on the other end, benefits may be gained by third parties as a result of production process. If we take the example of a forestry company that has planted trees and open roads and trails, that has provided recreational opportunities for runners, mountain bikers, etc. And this is a positive externality of production. Marginal social costs are those costs to society from the production of one more unit of a good or service. A marginal social cost is going to be lower than the marginal private cost when positive externalities are created, when the good or service is produced. And opposite, the marginal social cost is going to be higher when the marginal private cost than the marginal private cost when negative externalities are created, when that good or service is produced. So marginal private cost plus externalities equals the marginal social cost. And therefore we can state that marginal social cost equals marginal private cost plus external benefits, or marginal social cost equals a marginal private cost less any external harm that production causes, the production of one more unit causes. Now, externalities result in market failure. They cause the market to fail to achieve a social optimum where MSB, marginal social benefit, equals MSC, marginal social cost. And this is going to occur for two reasons. The first being, consumers may not consider the external costs or benefits associated with their consumption of a good or service. A smoker may be unconcerned that her consumption of cigarettes increases the cost of healthcare for all in society, a negative externality. And an individual consuming a vaccination, maybe not thinking that she is benefiting society by ensuring that she is immune to the flu. She just wants to avoid a nasty illness. Positive externality occurring there. And the second reason, producers may not consider the external costs or benefits associated with their production of a good or service. So a producer pursuing the objective of profit maximization may be unconcerned that her factory is polluting the air and negatively affecting others around the factory, that negative externality. And a forestry producer doesn't factor in all the recreational benefits their forest plantations may provide to society, the positive externalities. Therefore, when there are positive externalities, society gains. MSB or MSC is greater than the MPB or MPC, but at the free market price, the good or service is going to be overpriced and underproduced and underconsumed. Overpriced and underproduced and underconsumed when there's a positive externality. And when there is a negative externality, society loses. The marginal social benefit or marginal social cost is less than that of the marginal private benefit or marginal private cost. But in the free market, the price of the good or service is going to be underpriced and overproduced and overconsumed. Now we're going to go in there and take a look at the first of our externalities. In essence, we've got four. We've got externalities associated with production. There are two of these, negative and positive. And there are externalities of consumption. And again, there are two of these, negative and positive. And we're going to go and look at each in turn. But just in this lesson, we're focusing on negative externalities of production. So let's start. A private cost is a cost that firms incur in producing goods and services when they supply the market. Things such as wages and rent. These are costs to the firm, cost of production. Negative externalities of production, or the external costs affecting third parties, are created by firms in the process of producing goods and services, but they don't have to pay these costs. For example, the healthcare costs associated with a factory that pollutes the air. So on the y-axis here, we have price, benefit, and cost in dollars, and just quantity as per usual. supply equals marginal private cost, and demand equals a marginal private benefit, which equals a marginal social benefit. Marginal social cost is higher when there's a negative externality of production. This is the external cost to society. There's a loss of welfare because the good is overproduced and overconsumed. So the free market price is lower than the social price, and that results in the good being underpriced and overconsumed. The social costs of steel production are greater than the private costs. In a free market, the price of steel is too low, PE instead of P star, and the output of steel is too high. We have QE instead of Q star. And the difference between Q star and QE, marginal social costs, are greater than the marginal social benefits. The marginal social cost is less than the private benefit of steel consumption because of the negative externalities associated with the production of that good, and the yellow triangle here represents that total welfare loss, so the deadweight loss. So how can we correct for a negative externality of production? The first way we can do it is through legislation. So governments can legislate and regulate firms to reduce or prevent the spillover costs associated with these negative externalities of production. So if firms are polluting, then governments may ban the dumping of toxic waste and materials into the environment, such as factory using a river to dump its waste, as they used to do in the old days. So legislation is going to increase the costs of production to firms, and because they're going to have to find more environmentally friendly ways to dispose of their waste to stop their pollution. They're going to have to invest in new methods of production, cleaner production, raises the cost to firms. So legislation increases the cost to firms and raises cost to firms to the social cost. Can also have a production limit, production at pollution limit. And the pollution limit is imposed that restricts production to the efficient quantity. The efficient market equilibrium is achieved. The market price is equal to marginal private benefit, MPB, and marginal social cost, the MSC. So production limits will raise the cost to firms, the price will increase, and the quantity will decrease. Another way we can correct for negative externalities of production are indirect taxes. So pollution taxes seek an efficient outcome by making a polluter pay the marginal external cost of their pollution. Now governments could either impose a tax on each unit of output produced by the firm, or they could tax a per unit of pollution that is being emitted, such as would be the case with the carbon tax. Now we know an indirect tax is going to shift the supply curve, and it's exactly the same here. So the marginal private cost of producing will now increase to the marginal social cost. This is the efficient market equilibrium. We have the desirable quantity of steel being produced, the allocatively efficient quantity of steel being produced. There goes the pollution tax, the tax per unit. This raises the price. The government collects some tax revenue. This should all look pretty familiar. Now, by charging or taxing the producer at the rate equal to the marginal external cost, the marginal social cost curve becomes a market supply curve. So that tax results in supply decreasing, shifting up and to the left, from where supply equals a marginal private cost to where marginal social cost is now the marginal private cost plus that tax. So the market price rises and the quantity produced decreases to the efficient quantity. The government collects tax revenue by the amount shown in that yellow rectangle there, which of course can be easily calculated. An essential statement to get across to your examiners: a tax on pollution makes the polluter pay, and this internalizes the externality. Internalizes the externality. Examiners love that phrase. The costs that we're forced onto and paid by third parties are now paid by the producers and consumers who are producing and consuming in that market. We can use tradable permits to correct for negative externalities of production.
When gases like sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide are emitted into the atmosphere, they react with water, oxygen, and other chemicals to form sulfuric and nitric acid. And when these acids precipitate, we get acid rain. Acid rain can kill trees, plants, and fish, as well as erode automobile paint, buildings, and stone. The Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 introduced a novel way to combat acid rain: tradable permits. Wow. Here's how they work. Let's consider two power plants or factories that are polluters. They emit this much polluting gas. The government could control pollution by just commanding that all factories install certain technologies, like scrubbers. Using this command and control method, suppose that pollution would be reduced to this. Okay, but now imagine that one of the plants can reduce pollution at a lower cost than the other. Perhaps it's newer, or it uses a different type of coal, or maybe there is some other technology for reducing pollution that the government didn't consider, or perhaps the product produced in one of these factories has a less polluting substitute that we can easily switch to. Ideally, we want to reduce pollution here, where reducing pollution has a low cost, and less here, where reducing pollution has a high cost. If we do this, we can reduce pollution by exactly the same amount as before, but we can do it while wasting fewer other resources. Great. But wait. Unfortunately, the government doesn't know which plant is the low-cost plant. Remember, there are lots of ways of reducing pollution, lots of substitutes, and lots of substitutes for substitutes. No one person knows all the trade-offs. Information is dispersed. So how can we draw on this dispersed information and harness the energy of entrepreneurs to discover the best ways to reduce pollution? Instead of commanding how to reduce pollution, suppose the government issues pollution permits, rights to emit pollution. One permit gives you the right to emit, say, 1 ton of polluting gases. Pollution permits don't sound very environmentally friendly, but the government only issues a limited number of permits, and that equals the same total reduced pollution as under command and control. So in the end, pollution reduction is the same. By allowing the permits to be bought and sold, the profit-seeking self-interest of power plant owners is harnessed for the social good. The owner of the power plant with the low cost of reducing pollution thinks, I don't have to use my permits. I can reduce pollution at my plant for less money than I can get by selling my unused permits and make a tidy profit. Oh, yeah. Meanwhile, the power plant owner with the high costs wants to buy permits and is willing to pay a lot because it's cheaper to buy permits than reduce pollution at high cost. So, the power plant that can cheaply reduce pollution sells permits, and the power plant where it's expensive to reduce pollution buys permits. Both firms increase their profit. In this way, the invisible hand of the market gets us to the ideal solution. We reduce pollution more here, where reducing pollution is cheap, and less here, where reducing pollution is expensive. The total amount of pollution, however, is reduced just as much as with command and control, but at a lower cost. In fact, the tradable permit approach worked so well, it reduced air pollution at a much lower cost than any expert had anticipated. Why should we care about the cost of reducing pollution? Spending less on reducing pollution means that we have more to spend on other goods. But also, don't forget the law of demand. The lower price of pollution reduction, the more pollution we want to reduce. Tradable permits uses the invisible hand of the market to discover the lowest cost way of reducing pollution, and that's good for everyone. If you want to test yourself, click.
So let's model this here. We have price in dollars on one axis and carbon dioxide permits on the other. Carbon dioxide being a pollutant. Okay, the supply of permits is perfectly elastic and fixed at this quantity by the government. That just means that the government is going to issue so many carbon dioxide permits in total. Q1. The supply of permits is determined by the government, and then these are distributed to firms. Firms can't emit more pollution than the permits they have allow them to. The demand for such permits determines their market price. As the economy grows, the demand for such permits may increase, and so too will the price. Firms will have an incentive to reduce their emissions to reduce their cost of production, and or to sell permits to other less efficient firms to earn additional revenues. Now, over time, the government can reduce that supply of permits. So we shift from Q1 to Q2. The number of CO2 total CO2 permits that are out there in the economy are reduced over time. And that's going to reduce the level of pollution being emitted by firms operating in the economy. And this is going to further reduce the external costs imposed on third parties. Less pollution. Governments will usually purchase its own permits circulating in the economy, and that's going to reduce the supply available to firms. Government buys up these permits over time, and this reduces the supply. That perfectly inelastic. And as supply is reduced, the price of these permits are going to increase, providing firms with more incentives to reduce emissions and their cost of production. To become more profitable, firms can adopt new technologies and substitute to less polluting inputs. Natural gas instead of coal-fired electricity, for example.